And so we approached this issue from an athletic lens, looking at the historical roots of the sport and sex regulations, talking about how these restrictions are situated within a broader context of racist, gendered, ableist beliefs that continue to perpetuate inequalities and harm. And I'm just going to quickly note that in all our conversations and community, um, when talking about run culture, we like to name these things and to say that they don't exist in a vacuum. So calling out these systems like white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy, and all of it, because then it gives shape to the harm and it opens up pathways for resistance and for us in community to push back. And so having said that, this month we're going to look at this conversation from a more personal micro scale, seeing how it impacts our relationships to each other and to our bodies. And the reason that I wanted to talk to you is because you have all this research and you've been involved in this conversation for many years than I have. And then also, too, I'm looking for insights on how to move the conversation forward. It's not just have the conversation, but to move it to somewhere where we're not just talking about like these new um, things, laws being enacted. So to start, for those that don't know you and don't know this incredible documentary, Tested, that you did, and that also won an award recently. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So please share a bit about yourself and the documentary. And here I'll also say that you can share anything and everything that you want to include, all the juicy details that didn't make, the cut.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to the folks within your community because, for talking about this project, I feel like sometimes I end up talking to people who are really on the science side and really on the gender side. And it's actually really fun to talk to fellow sports people who are like really interested in the sportsy part of it. And so I come from a sports background. I was a runner. I do powerlifting now. I played soccer, and all of the things that you talk about around running are things I have lived. And there's a reason I don't really run right now for because of all of the things that you've talked about. I'm getting back into it. I'm slowly jogging again, and I'm, working through all of that, as I'm sure you can all relate to. And yeah, and so I've followed this story for a long time. And so Tested is about this 100-year history of sort of gender verification or sex testing in elite sports. This idea that governing bodies of sports need to have some kind of policy, some kind of system by which they decide which women are allowed to compete and which women are not allowed to compete. And, I got into this story probably the same way a lot of other people who have heard of this maybe have, which is through Caster Semenya, who was a South African runner who sort of burst onto the scene in 2009, ran this incredible race at the World Championships, and then immediately was thrust into this really brutal media cycle talking about her body, what she looked like, was she really a woman? All of these really terrible things. Her medical records were leaked. It was just this really awful experience. She has an autobiography, a memoir that has just come out last year that I highly recommend reading, that talks all about this and sort of reveals even more than we ever knew before. And she does so with actually quite a lot of humor, and she's very funny. But so I sort of remember seeing these headlines and thinking, well, hold on, what are we saying here? Like, what is the actual allegation that people are making? And what does it mean to say, as the head of the governing body of track and field at the time, yes, she is a woman, but maybe not 100%. And I remember seeing that and thinking, like, what does that mean? Like, what are we talking about? Like, what exactly are we saying? And I spent, the last 10 years researching this and was really shocked to learn a lot of things that I, even as a huge sports fan and, a big track and field fan, I've watched it my whole life basically, had no idea about, which is, things like from the 60s to the 1990s until 1999, in fact, every woman at the Olympics had to go through gender verification and get a little femininity card, a certificate of femininity. It looks a little bit like your driver's license, and it says, like certified female on it. And, I had no idea that that was a thing that was happening for 30 years, right? And so Tested is about that history, but then also follows the storyline of two athletes who were really trying to make it to the Paris Olympics, one of whom was sort of playing by the rules and following the regulations that existed that came out in 2023 that said that some athletes with so-called differences of sex development is the term that World Athletics, the governing body of track and field, uses, shouldn't be allowed to compete unless they lower their body's naturally occurring testosterone levels. And Christine Bulma and a couple of other athletes, but Christine was the one that I mainly followed, said, you know what? I want to run. And so I'm going to do it. I'm going to take these drugs that I don't want to take and I don't need to take, but because I want to run, I have to take them. And we also followed Max Amali, who's a Kenyan athlete, who said, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that, and tried to take World Athletics to court over these regulations. And so we followed them in their attempts to kind of get to Paris, make it to the Olympics, get justice. And then in the background, this sort of long history of these policies, where they come from, what the alleged evidence is that they are necessary. And it was just this really, I mean, it was really eye-opening for me to learn about all of this, because I think it just really highlights so many of the kind of arbitrary decisions that get made and the ways in which systems of power impose themselves upon these women. And the other thing I'll say is that for Tested, the women that we talked to and all the women I interviewed and featured are all cis women. They're not trans women. They were all assigned female at birth and live as women now. There is a sort of attempt right now amongst folks who are in favor of these sort of exclusionary policies to try and rewrite that and claim that, in fact, the phrase that they're using now is misdiagnosed males, is the phrase that they are using. This idea that, well, yes, it was just actually a mistake that they were assigned female at birth, which is problematic in all sorts of ways that we can get into if you like, but I won't get into now. But yeah, and I think, Tested really shows that there's this really big challenge in sports, where sports are one of the very few last places where there is a pretty rigid sex binary, right? There are two categories. And many of us know that that is not how it works in the world, that the world is much more diverse and complicated than that. And that presents a real challenge, right? It presents a sort of a struggle that I think people have tried to answer for many years and have sort of failed to figure out how to do so in a way that doesn't harm people. And we can talk maybe about what the answers might be, or what we should do, is a question we get a lot. But yeah, I think it was a very long process in which I got really obsessed with this topic for many, many, many years. And I think that the women who we feature are just very compelling in and of themselves, right? These incredible athletes who've gone through not just what it takes to be an elite athlete. I mean, training at an Olympic level is just unreal. And also on top of that, being told you're not really a woman, you're not actually that good, right? It's just because you have this secret thing that is an unfair advantage that you didn't work for. You shouldn't be allowed. We're going to talk publicly about your body in ways that are really gross and invasive. And how do you try and maintain even training amidst all of that? I mean, it's just unfathomable to me. I would give up immediately if it was me in that situation. So that's what Tested is all about. And that's kind of how I came to it.
Wow. Thank you for going over the documentary and just what brought you to the conversation. And I want to share a bit about how I came to this topic myself and what drew me to it. So I had this conversation twice before in community, and I remember the first time we came to the conversation, there was very little. I think it was 2021 we first had the conversation, and I couldn't find too much research out there that was done then. Like your documentary was not out then. And so I remember struggling to find things to just like have this conversation. And one of the things that I struggled with back then is like, how do we talk about this? Because there's the way it's framed in the mainstream, that's one thing, and then having it in community is different. And in community, I like to let folks know I'm not pretending to know everything about the trans experience and these bans and sex regulation policies that are out there, or even the struggles that intersex athletes face. But what I do know from my community experience and activism is that it's important to have this conversation. And so just like looking for different ways to come to this conversation, one of which being that, these kinds of exclusionary and restrictive laws are not new. Um, if we look at the history and the policing of bodies and the controlling of bodies, particularly bodies that exist outside the dominant norms of race, gender, sex, ability, body size, you see that it's been happening for years. This control of bodies, non-normative bodies. And I I was like, this therefore allows people to just like come to the conversation knowing that it's not just about sports, but it's about power and control. And most, I find, people living under oppressive systems can speak to that, how they navigate life under that. And another way I look at this conversation is by locating myself and my um, identities and my privileges. So, coming to this conversation as someone with marginalized identities, I identify as a Kenyan, Somali, Black, Muslim woman. And at the same time, I live in a small, cis, able body. So, just looking at how all of those things come together to allow me to view this conversation and then almost like giving others permission to do the same and use an intersectional lens when having this conversation um, is important, I find, because then you can really get at the nuance and the like, yeah, move away from the simplistic framework of black and white, us versus them. You can like really see that this is like not only a trans issue or an intersex issue, it like affects all of us when it comes down to who's in power and who's trying to control our bodies and why. And I find that's like a more approachable way to have the conversation. And I know listening to the series that you shared that it was that headline you saw about Caster Semenya that brought you to it, but also loving history and loving science. And so, what other lenses did you use when having this, when doing the research? Yeah, like, was there room for you to explore all of that? And maybe even feel free to share. Were some of the things you wanted to include and not aligning with people who are producers telling you, leave that out, we can't go there. So yeah, just share what the process was like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think anytime you have a story like this that sort of spans 100 years, it touches history and science and, power and, the like all of these different things, bodies, gender. I am the kind of person who will fall down a rabbit hole and be like, this is so interesting. And then you have to zoom out and you only have so many hours that you can put into the documentaries. There were I mean, I often say that we could have made a whole another 6 episode series of all the stuff that I cut from the show and had to cut. And, I was very fortunate. I was nervous about working with, I come from sort of like an indie podcasting world where, I've been able to in the past sort of have a lot of creative freedom and really talk about things in ways that I think are important. And this is my first project with two very large media organizations, both CBC, Canadian Broadcast Company, and NPR, National Public Radio. And when we first started working together, I was actually pretty nervous that perhaps I might be asked to be a little more gentle or be a little more circumspect about certain things, naming certain things, talking about certain things. And that didn't happen. I was really thankful that, we did have to pass legal review, right? There are certain things, you can't say. But on the whole, everybody who was working on the project was really supportive and really interested in getting this right and, doing this the way that, it felt good for everyone involved. And so I'm really thankful for the team that helped me make the project. But yeah, I mean, there's the historical angle, right? There's the fact that, the first time women get to compete on the track, 1928. As soon as that happens at the Olympics, immediately you have people in the newspaper saying, those are not really women. There's something wrong with those women, right? And that was really fascinating. You sort of immediately have, this is something that I think didn't make it into the final piece in sort of a more robust way, but one of the main drivers of the early sex testing in the 30s and 40s was a man named Avery Brundage, who was in charge of many parts of the US sort of Olympic structures and was an avowed Nazi, right? Was someone who was very much in cahoots with the Nazi Party, who is on record as being incredibly anti-Semitic, fought for the US not to boycott the 1936 Olympics, right, under the Nazis. And you have, him being a really big driver of this. You have this in 1928, one of the first women who gets questioned is a Japanese woman, right? So immediately you have sort of racial elements coming into play. You have people describing her body in ways that are sort of surreal because especially now, we look at athletes and we see elite athletes being incredibly muscular, right? On the women's side, which is great. Like we love to see it, right? Like, and this is not to say that those women don't get commentary about their muscles and what they look like, but you would hear people saying, you'd read in the newspaper, people talking about this Japanese woman, Hitomi Kinwe, and they would say things like, she looks like a linebacker. And then you look at her and it's 1928. These are tiny women. They don't if you were to walk like today, if you were to see her on the street, you wouldn't be like, that looks like a line. It's just like the ideas even of what an athletic body looked like have changed so much over time. And so I got to kind of dig into that. I traveled all around the world. I went to the IOC archives in Switzerland. We went all over. And then on the science front, like my first sort of career was in science. My degree is in science. And one of the things I think that drew me to this story is this continued assertion that science shows that there's this advantage and that science is on their side. And it's sort of this weird story where everybody claims on all sides that they're the ones following the science. And of course, like that can't be true because you have different ideas of what's going on. And so digging into that, what does that look like? How do you study elite athletes? I mean, even setting aside all of the confounding factors that we're talking about here, it's actually quite challenging to study elite athletes. There aren't that many of them. They are sort of biologically, and I say this with great affection, I love athletes, but sort of freaks of nature, right? Like this is what we're doing when we're looking at elite athletes. We're looking at people who have bodies and have, ways of being that are just different. I am never going to be an elite athlete. Like that is just no amount of money and training and any of it is going to get me to the Olympics. And that's just how it is, right? We know this. And so in light of that, I was really curious, okay, well, given that we know that elite athletes are genetically distinct, right? And sort of physically distinct and this is not even getting into the ways in which many elite athletes are financially distinct and have sort of financial benefits. There are people who can afford training that others can't, right? I think this also puts the sort of allegation of advantage into a new light for me when you think about, you have folks who are, World Athletics is based in Monaco. You have folks who have all of the resources available to a person, who have multiple trainers, who have a staff nutritionist, alleging that someone like Maximali in Kenya, who can barely afford to feed herself 3 meals a day, has an advantage, right? What kinds of advantages are okay and what kinds of advantages are not. I think there's that lens to think about it through, but I got to go into the science. And I think that your point is a really good one, which is that it's, even if you don't know much about this, it's confusing for a variety of reasons. There are many different people making many different claims that are hard to check out, that are hard to actually understand. And I would argue that in some cases that's intentional, right? There's an intentional muddying of the waters here because, for example, World Athletics has in the last couple of years really doubled down on the idea that, for example, trans women, athletes with variations in sex biology, which some people would call intersex and some people wouldn't. DSD athletes is the term that World Athletics uses, differences of sex development. And cis men are all exactly the same, right? That these are all like synonyms. Of course, that's not true. We know that's not true. But they've intentionally kind of tried to muddy the water because if you do that, then you can say, well, look at all of the scientific research about the gap in performance between cis men and cis women. It's about 9 to 13%. Bing, bang, boom. We have our proof of advantage. We're done here. I would argue that's not good science, right? Just saying the two things are equivalent so that you can use the number from over here is not how evidence is built properly. But that is kind of the move that we're seeing happen. And it's if you're just a sort of person who's reading the news or looking at headlines, it's really confusing. It's genuinely
Mhm.
very confusing.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
part of my goal for Tested was to offer people a way of trying to sort of tease out some of these threads. And the last thing I'll say is I think that to your point earlier that we all have ways of coming into this story and ways of connecting with this story, even if we're not elite athletes, even if we're not, I'm obviously white. I'm born and raised in the United States. I have that kind of privilege going for me. Um, we all have bodies
Mhm.
that, we should be allowed to have and not, have sort of invasive tests be done, not have people you've never met be telling you who you are, which
Yeah.
I think is always a really baffling part of the story where you have people who, have never met Christine, never met Castor, have never talked to any of their family members or doctors or anything, making confident assertions about like their sex and gender, right? And I'm always baffled by that. But also now we've seen a couple of weeks ago, World Athletics announced that they were going to bring back mandatory sex testing for all female athletes at the elite level, right? And
Mhm.
so now all of a sudden, it's not just these athletes who are being impacted by the policy. Now, because we haven't sort of cut the root of this out, we're sort of circling back to this idea that we actually need to test everybody again. And now every woman's privacy is about to be violated. And we're about to spend all this money and
Mhm.
resources doing a thing that doesn't need to happen and in fact
Mhm.
has harms associated with it. So,
Mhm.
I think anybody with a body can relate to
Yeah.
not maybe wanting that kind of
Yeah.
scrutiny and that kind of invasion.
This is how we should be having the conversation, and this is how we can attempt to do something about it. So we're not just stuck on just looking at it as just like these single issues that don't affect us and our communities, because it really does. All of this has consequences for how people feel comfortable in their own bodies and also relate to each other, especially women. And that brings me to my next question. So, one of the challenges that we've heard in our community when it comes to having conversations about running, sex, and gender is that is this idea that this isn't our issue, a women's issue, that if you're not trans or if you're not an intersex individual, that you cannot speak to this, you cannot engage in the conversation. And I think part of this stems from what you were sharing about how trans and intersex athletes are often portrayed in these mainstream narratives as not real women. I think this portrayal feeds into the perception that the struggles that they face are separate from women's issues rather than being deeply connected to them. So, what are some of the ways that you navigate that contradiction where the regulation of trans and intersex athletes is framed as protecting women, yet at the same time, the struggles that trans and intersex athletes face aren't seen as a concern for women because they're not seen as women, they're not biological women. What does it mean to challenge that framing within the sport and in our communities? Yeah.
It's a great question. And I think that, there are a couple of things I'll say. One is that division, the sort of like real women and then this other
Mhm.
group, it only serves to further the power of those who want to sort of maintain control.
Mhm.
And we are stronger together. We are stronger when we talk to each other and like are in community with one another. And I think that remembering that in the case, for example, of the folks I spoke with for Tested, none of these women knew there was anything different about themselves until they got a phone call from World Athletics saying, surprise, you're not actually a woman, right? Our tests show this.
Mhm.
And if that can happen to them because of something that they've decided, a test that World Athletics has decided determines,
Mhm.
who's a woman, who isn't, who else can it happen to, right? I think that as soon as you allow for the exclusion of an entire group of people simply based on how they were born from a huge cultural institution like sports, I
Mhm.
mean, that is an incredibly slippery slope. That is an incredibly dangerous precedent to set. We're seeing now in the United States the ways in which vulnerable communities are being attacked and quite literally disappeared off the street for saying that something that the government doesn't like, for, naming things that are happening.
Yeah.
And so these are all connected struggles, right? This idea that, well, I'm safe because I'm a woman and
Mm.
I'm not, I'm a citizen and I'm a this and I'm a that. It won't, this doesn't impact me. It will eventually, right? If you don't sort of stand up for that.
Yeah.
Um, so I think there's that. I think, I do understand that some folks feel, even if they want to speak up, feel a little bit nervous, right? Because they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to be insensitive. They understand that like, language here really does matter, but also maybe I'm not totally up on the language and I don't want to, I've encountered this a lot when I talk about tests where people say, look, I'm really afraid that I'm going to, use the wrong term or,
Mhm.
do something. And I don't feel confident speaking on this.
Yeah.
And that's like very relatable. I've been there too, where I'm like, oh no, like I want to say something, but like I don't fully feel like I have it
Yeah.
exactly and all of that. And I think there are a couple things I think about with that, which is that for folks who are nervous, in general, I think that I at least can tell when someone is in good faith trying to understand something, right?
Mm.
And I care much more about that than if you get the word wrong, right?
Mhm.
And if you come to the conversation with like an openness and sort of a generosity and a willingness to be corrected without freaking out, right? Like we all need to kind of practice and it's not that fun, right? It's not fun to be told that you're wrong. I get that. We all have experienced that feeling of like knee jerk, like, I'm trying though, and you kind of get in your head about it, right? I
Yeah.
think there's for every single person, there is some topic on which that you're just going to end up in that position. Um, but I think it's worth it to practice that. It's worth it to ask the questions again, generously and in good faith, be willing to be corrected, listen, because we need to practice that not just on this topic, we need to practice that across so many different things, right? One of the things I think about a lot is Dean Spade, who is this incredible author who wrote a book about mutual aid and sort of how to kind of get involved in mutual aid and what sort of it is and how to think about it. When you talk to him and when he gives advice about what is sort of the tips for getting involved in mutual aid, one of them is, listen, you're going to end up working with and being in community with people who you don't have the same language and you don't necessarily have the same priors and you maybe are going to mess up and they're going to mess up and you just need to be willing to work in community with one another. And that sort of goes both ways, right? I think so much of this requires us to, and this is like online communities are very real and they're very valuable, but sometimes we need to like meet people in person and have the conversation and, be a little bit uncomfortable. And all of that, I think, builds a stronger base from which we can then work together, right? And that sort of connection. Yeah, like I do not know what it is like to be an immigrant in the United States, right? And maybe talking to somebody, I might say something that I don't realize is the wrong thing to say. And they correct me and I say, okay, great. Now I know, right?
Mhm.
Now I know. And now I move forward.
Mhm.
And vice versa. Sometimes I talk to folks and they'll say something or they'll use language around trans athletes or intersex athletes. And I'll say, hey, just FYI, like, this is why we sort of talk about it this way. And they say, great, thanks. And we move on together
Mhm.
instead of fracturing out and splintering away. I do think that some of our online discourse has made people feel very worried about being canceled or being yelled at
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
whatever it is. And cancel culture as described by like white male comedians is not a real thing, but it sometimes can happen in community, right? We've all seen this happen where people just like jump down each other's throats immediately and you're like, we like all we have is each other. Like we
Mhm.
gotta come together and figure this out together. So as much as possible, centering the voices of trans and intersex folks, if you know them and talk to them. But like I would rather personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I definitely don't speak for all trans people or all, non-binary people or anything like that. But I would much rather have a conversation in which someone sort of fumbles towards an understanding and maybe messes up, quote unquote, but in good faith, than someone completely ignore the topic because they're too afraid to
Yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah. 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 I mean, being in community, I see all of that happening. Like there's this fear, and that fear stops you from having the conversation. It stunts the conversation. That's why I feel like it's partly cyclical, like what's happening. Like we're still stuck on that same conversation. And we see the same things happening. But if we then are okay with making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, owning accountability, and then so just like owning when you make a mistake, when you harm someone, and then just doing better. Another thing that I noticed about framing and the coverage of this issue in the mainstream is that it's reduced to very like a simple black and white, neutral discussion, like almost depoliticized. And I think this undermines the struggles that people are making to push back against systems, oppressive systems. And I've seen also that it's not accidental. It's definitely by design, because having these black and white conversations, those in power stay in power, and then the status quo is unchallenged and unchecked. And this kind of makes me think of recreational running in the sense that over the years it's become trendy for runners to use activist language and align themselves with political movements and brand sponsorships. Brands love this and encourage this messaging. But because of that association to the brands, like it's oftentimes like very hollow and shallow, what you see being promoted, because there's a limit. There's like you cannot be too political, especially if your aim or your intention is to disrupt the sport, or challenge the very foundations that it was built upon. And you touch on a lot of these tensions with the documentary. So you show how, yeah, complex it all is. And I'd love to hear more on that, for particularly with regards to the IOC, which, correct me, International Olympic Committee. Yeah,
Correct. You
the
got it.
IOC and the World Athletics, their relationship and how they parted ways, um, with regards to the DSD regulation. Can you help us unpack a bit of that dynamic and what happened there?
Yeah. I think everything you've described is so real. And I mean, just as an example, in 2018, Nike did an ad with Castor, right? They featured Castor in an ad. And it's this like, I was born to run. They have this child sort of essentially acting as Castor's, like the young Castor, and then they have adult Castor. And it's this classic Nike, inspirational ad. But of course, Nike is not going to show up for Castor around being banned, right? They're using her story as a way to sort of promote themselves and touch and sort of like hit that kind of quote unquote diversity,
Mhm.
etc. messaging. But where's Nike now, right? Nike is not showing up, right? Nike's a brand. Nike's a brand that has a brand to protect, and they are going to go whatever way the wind, the political winds kind of go. And yeah, and so I think there's a really interesting thing happening with, I'm glad you asked about the IOC and World Athletics, and I think it can be very confusing because there's a billion acronyms and it's like, who are all these people? But also there has been this sort of interesting development over time around different sports organizations and how they think about this. And they at one point were kind of simpatico, like all together, making decisions together, and then they've kind of diverged. In the 90s ish is when the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and World Athletics, the governing body of track and field, kind of parted ways on this topic, at least. Interestingly, World Athletics dropped mandatory gender verification before the IOC did. So in the 90s, it was actually World Athletics. They were at the time not called World Athletics, but it was the same organization. They were the ones to first drop gender verification, which is sort of interesting. And it took the IOC until 1999 to do so. And now what we're seeing is kind of a reversal, which is that World Athletics is sort of moving back towards this more regressive, older idea around we need to test everybody. We need to sort of protect women's sports from women who want to compete in those sports, right? I tried to interview World Athletics for Tested, and they declined to answer any of my questions. They sent me sort of a short email, and in the email, one of the assertions they make is that if they don't do this, if they don't have these policies, women and girls will not choose sport. Um, Now, some people might argue that requiring someone to be mandatory sex tested is a reason why people might not choose sport, but you
Yeah.
know, they have no evidence of that assertion. I don't know, it's all a little bit hand wavy here. But so the IOC has sort of moved towards this idea, and one sort of interesting thing about sports is that there are lots of people who would love for sports to be totally apolitical, right? That like, there's sort of this idea that gets leveraged pretty much exclusively against athletes who speak up, which is like the kind of shut up and dribble quote, like just stop trying to make this about something. See this with Colin Kaepernick, you see this with, hoodies during the Trayvon Martin era, you see kneeling, you see it just anytime an athlete speaks up about anything outside of sports, they are told sports shouldn't be political. Stop
Mhm.
trying to do this.
Mhm.
Of course, we all know that sports can't be apolitical. That's just not possible because it's humans, and people compete in their physical bodies, and their lived reality is within the world, right? When LeBron James gets interviewed about this, he says, I looked at Trayvon Martin and I saw that could have been my son, right? That could have been my
Mhm.
kid. It's sort of absurd to ask these athletes who, especially those who live in marginalized bodies, to just not talk about it and not pay attention to it. But the IOC has really tried to lean into this idea that they are this, if not apolitical, this kind of like globally unifying office where every 4 years we all put aside all of the sort of like messy, annoying, geopolitical stuff, and we come together at the Olympics, right? And we compete, and it's all great.
Mhm.
Again, this is a fantasy, right? This is a fantasy that is very alluring. I get it. It would be so nice if we could, sometimes just turn off the news and just watch people play sports or whatever. But of course, we all know that's not how it works, right?
Mhm.
Every Olympics, there are things going on. Um, and you can't really separate out these things, but in part because of that, and then on top of that, you had a couple of Olympics that were sort of really marred by pretty clear human rights violations, right? You had, Brazil have you had a couple of issues in terms of construction, in terms of the different countries that were given the Olympics. There was sort of this period of time where the IOC was really dogged by these human rights
Mhm.
complaints.
Mhm.
And so combining all of that, they've really switched to what they would describe as sort of a human rights framing for all of their work. Now, skeptics say that this is all just sort of like the Nike ad, it's all for show. They don't really care. I
Mhm.
think it's sort of somewhere in between. I do think there are genuinely people at the IOC who took those criticisms very seriously and are actually really trying to build an Olympics where all athletes are treated with dignity and with respect and don't have to worry about these things. Side note, it will be very interesting to know whether the LA 2028 Olympics can even happen, given that. Um, I am not convinced that that's a great idea, given that you cannot safely travel to the United States right now from many
Yeah.
countries, but
Yeah. Yeah.
that is a separate question. Um, and so, as part of that, the IOC actually came out with a document that said, hey, you know, we don't think that it's appropriate to regulate the gender of athletes in this way. We don't think it's appropriate to say that inherently, women with biological variations around sex have an advantage. If you don't have any evidence, which currently World Athletics has no direct evidence of that, they have a lot of circumstantial evidence. And even that is a little spicy, perhaps. But they said, listen, all of you sports, you need to be thinking about this as inclusive as possible. The goal should be to include as many people as possible and not exclude people, as opposed to kind of trying to design a policy so that you can exclude, right? That's sort of the slight distinction in thinking. Now, the IOC in this case is a little bit like the UN in that they don't really have any enforcement mechanism, right? They can't make World Athletics do anything, really. The IOC doesn't regulate sports, right? Though that is what World Athletics is. World Athletics is a governing body, an international federation is what they're called in the sort of parlance of sports policy. And there's one for track and field, there's one for swimming, there's one for every sport, and they all get to make their own rules. Because the IOC basically, and this was very early on in the 30s and 40s, the IOC realized basically that they can't possibly oversee every single sport. That's just like not possible given the sort of scale of sports. And so they're in the situation where the IOC can say all it wants about what it thinks that sports organizations should do in this case, but they can't make them do that, right? So that's what we have here. We have the IOC saying, hey, we don't think it's appropriate to have policies like this unless you have really clear cut evidence that these athletes in these sports have a really big advantage, which that evidence does not exist, but they can't do anything about it. And so that's why we have the situation where World Athletics can decide and continue to decide that this is a topic that they're going to commit to, that they're going to bring back mandatory sex testing, that they're going to, ban all so-called DSD athletes, that they're going to ban all trans athletes. And there's nothing that the IOC can do to stop them. And because each international federation kind of has its own rules and its own culture and its own way of thinking about the world, you get this really hodgepodge patchwork of policies. And the other thing I'll say about these international federations like World Athletics is that they're kind of beholden to no one, right? They don't have to answer to a government really. They don't answer to the IOC who doesn't really, regulate them in that way. I mean, World Athletics is based in Monaco. Like a lot of these international federations are based in countries where, I guess in theory, if you really wanted to do something, you might take them to court in their home country. Like it's actually really challenging for athletes to do anything about this in terms of like power dynamics. I mean, the only place that you can really take any kind of international federation, any sporting body, is a court in Switzerland called the Court of Arbitration for Sport that isn't actually a real court. It's an arbitration body, right? They like, it's just you're so as an athlete, I think sometimes people see these elite athletes that go to the Olympics or they're in the NBA or they're in the NFL or the WNBA and they think, wow, these people are really rich and really powerful and like they should be doing all these things. And I think what people don't realize is how disempowered athletes, even incredibly successful athletes, are. They have almost no power in their contracts, in where their biological data goes, in what they are allowed to do and say. They sign over almost all of their legal rights into these arbitration clauses in their contracts. I mean, they just don't actually have a lot of recourse when things go wrong. And it's one of the reasons why athletes are often so reticent to speak up because they are risking what is already often a very short career. And it's really hard.
Okay, my last question. Um, and yeah, again, I really appreciate like how you hold space for the nuance with this conversation. And something that I wasn't really aware of, but like you pointing it out in the series made sense. You talk about how trans and intersex athletes can sometimes end up at odds with each other as they both try to protect their own place in the sport. And yeah, that was like, yeah, like but it's like again how women get pitted against each other. So I'm seeing that play out, and it made sense when you pointed it out. But it's like it's not okay, totally by design, I feel. And you also talk about all the confusion surrounding the two groups and how they're oftentimes seen as the same group, which is problematic. The other thing that I really appreciated was how, unlike most mainstream media, you are focusing in on these two African intersex athletes. Because a lot of the times, like living here in North America, I see examples of trans athletes being banned and that being the focus. So I appreciated you taking this approach, looking at it at a global lens and not from North American lens. Um, that said, I was curious about where you decided to talk about trans athletes in the series itself, because I feel like that didn't come up until much later. And also, like, and I guess this is speaks to where I'm coming from with this discussion and just like almost immediately looking at the misogynoir that's playing out and the anti-Blackness and racism. And then you bring that up in episode think four.
Four, yeah.
Yeah, so I was like really curious how this happened, like l later in the series versus
Yeah.
like at the beginning. And I know journalists sometimes don't have much freedom with regards to that structuring
Mhm.
of their stories. And yeah, maybe just talk about a bit more about like what you chose to include and why you included where you did. And then perhaps a bit about the pushback that you received, because I know you said you pitched this story for 8 years,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
yeah, you didn't get the okay until after. So yeah, I'm just curious about all of that.
Yeah, they're really good questions, and it was a something that I struggled with a lot in just the production of where do these things go, right? There's super important points. This question of the fact that in this modern testosterone era, since 2009, since Castor, it's interesting you say, oh, you appreciated that I didn't focus on a sort of white North American woman. There is no white North American woman who has been accused in this modern. Like I could not do that because that person does not exist. Um, and so, it wasn't even a choice, right? Which is obviously telling, right? What does it mean when the only women who have been caught up in these policies since 2009 are Black and brown women from the global South? Almost all of them are from Africa. So there's obviously Duti's from India. There's a couple of other folks, but there is no white woman, as far as I'm aware, who has been caught up in this, which is a really important point and is, in and of itself telling about what is it, like how does that even happen? What are we doing here? And we thought a lot about how and where to include that because it is really important. And we wanted to make sure we gave it space to sort of live as something we talk about. And we talk about not only the fact that this is true, but also, why it might be true and what are the specific sort of named things that are happening here instead of just sort of noting it and then moving on and saying like, well, isn't that strange? Like I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Um, we wanted to have space to talk about the reasons that you hear when you ask about this amongst the folks who are in favor of these policies, what they say when you say, well, hold on, like, how is this possible? And they contest that it is not at all about race. It has nothing to do with that. This is just sort of by chance in some cases, or there's this allegation that you hear that DSD conditions are more common in Africa. Now, this is not true. There's no evidence of that. And it even just on its face doesn't make a ton of sense because differences of sex development, DSD, is this really big umbrella category that has almost a dozen different diagnoses that have all different kinds of mechanisms. And Africa is a very large place that is extremely genetically diverse. So this idea that, we do know that there are some cases where certain genetic variations are more common in certain populations, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about like an incredibly huge place and this very large category. And if you look into this, what you find is that the sort of original source for this claim is this paper from 1970 by a white South African researcher who's working well within sort of like apartheid South Africa in the eugenics tradition, trying to show this thing. And this sort of sits really um, sort of centrally to a core thesis of eugenics, which is this idea that white people are more evolved and Black people are less evolved. And therefore, of course, in the logic of this sort of thinking, Black people would be more likely to be hermaphroditic, is the terms that they were using at the time in the 70s, because lower level creatures like nematodes are more likely to be hermaphroditic. So there's this whole idea within eugenics, right, that it would make sense in their worldview for there to be a higher level or higher rates of intersex conditions. That's what they called it at the time, also among Black Africans. And this is this paper that all this claim comes from. The thing that makes me a little bit like lose my mind a little bit about this is that if you actually read the paper that gets cited, this eugenicist was not even able to prove his claim. Like he actually says in the paper, I couldn't prove this. This actually does, I don't have any evidence of this. And yet, here, all these years later, wait, we're hearing this. And so if that's not true, if it isn't true that DSD conditions are more common in Africa, then why are we seeing only Black and brown women from the global South being caught up? And of course, the answer is all sorts of things, partially just that these are not blanket tests. They're only done when someone is challenged, and someone is challenged because they don't look like a woman, right? When we talk about this. So figuring out where to put that within the series was a challenge because it's important and we wanted to spend a good amount of time on it. But in order to get there, you kind of needed a bit of the sort of like getting to the testosterone era, right? Because before that, you do have white women being sort of accused. You have Helen Stevens, who's an American. You have in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you have something sort of different happening. And so we kind of needed to get to that point in the sort of like history before we could kind of get to that. But yeah, I think, episode 4 was the sort of place we put it. Could we have put it earlier? Yeah, maybe. And I think we struggled. That's a unit that we kind of moved around a lot in our like attempts to figure out where to put it. And with trans athletes, it was another really interesting challenge because we put it right at the very, very end, right? We sort of say in the first episode, like, this is not about trans athletes. And then at the very end, we say, here's a trans athlete that we're going to talk to about the ways in which this obviously does connect, right? Who gets to compete as a woman is a sort of broad question. On that, the reason for that is because, like I said earlier, there has been this intentional muddying between intersex, trans, DSD, as World Athletics would call it. And I actually generally don't refer to the athletes in tested as intersex because they do not call themselves that. They do not self-identify as intersex. Christine, Max, Beatrice, Amina, like all of the women I interviewed for the series, they don't identify as intersex. And so it's just not a word that I tend to use for them because I sort of try to use the language that people use for themselves. And there is this tendency, I think, and it makes complete sense among sort of well-meaning, often folks in the sort of global north to say, well, we need to have solidarity across like LGBTQIA, right? Like, okay, you're intersex, I'm trans, like we should be in solidarity with each other. We should be, and that is definitely true. And that is really powerful. And also insisting on that for some of these women is forcing them into identity they don't have, right? That they don't identify as part of that community. And also in some situations puts them at actual physical risk. So we know that in some nations where some of these women come from, it is illegal to be any part of that. Uganda, for example, has one of the most regressive laws on the books where they punish what they call aggravated homosexuality, which includes literally just being trans or being intersex with the death penalty. And so asking these women or sort of pushing these women into that category, even if for sort of good reasons, is actually something that is unsafe for them. And so when I was first trying to convince these women to talk to me for the series, which took years, right? I sort of talked to these women for years before I interviewed them for Tested. One of the first questions they would always ask me is this going to be about trans athletes? Because if so, I can't be part of this. Like I can't participate in this. And so I took that very seriously and, really take those kinds of things really seriously. And so I told them, no, we're not like, we are going to make very clear, like that you are not a trans athlete, that like, this is what's going on. And I wanted to be true to that. And so we are very clear throughout the series that this is a show about these athletes with sex variations. This is not a show about trans athletes. And we sort of at the very end talk about the ways in which their struggles do or don't overlap or are sometimes at tension with each other. But it was really important to me to sort of honor that, A, their identity, and B, their safety. And that is why trans athletes are at the very, very end. I recognize that some folks really don't like that. I've gotten some emails from people being like, this needed to come sooner. And I respect that. That is a totally valid opinion to have. And, I think there are things happening behind the scenes that maybe might color that opinion that I just sort of described. But that is sort of why that is at the end. And that is why we sort of use the language that we do and we put it where it is.
That makes absolute sense. And I think it also speaks to this idea of just gender and the labels we have, like woman, man, trans. There's this book, I forget the name of the author, but it's called Decolonizing Trans, and they talk about how trans is not a universal label. like even in places where people might seem as they identify as trans,
Right.
not necessarily seeing themselves as trans,
Right.
and how important it is not to have this umbrella, universal umbrella, and include all of these people. So it speaks to so much else that's going on, and you do an incredible job like getting at these nuanced pieces of the conversation. And thank you so much. Like maybe share more about how people can find Tested and where they can
Sure.
listen and what you're doing next. And if you
Yeah.
plan to, yeah, is there something that you feel like you want to focus in on more? I know you have like a newsletter
Yes.
where you cover all the things that you left out. So yeah, maybe share all of that and how people can find more about this topic.
Yeah, thank you. These questions have been great. Yeah, so you can find more about Tested at tested-podcast.com, and you can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's on everything. So like Apple, Spotify, whatever app you use. On the website at tested-podcast.com, there's actually a bunch more resources as well, including a timeline of about 100 years of history and all the various things that have happened. We also have a glossary for terms that, if you're not familiar with, might be useful. I wrote a longer piece about language and sort of why we use the words that we use in Tested. I talked a little bit about that in terms of why I don't use intersex. And there are other words, and it sort of talks a little bit too about the ways in which it can be challenging to, as you sort of pointed out, use language in trying to talk about something when language changes culturally and over time, right? The term intersex has gone through so many different meanings in the last 100 years that it actually has all of this really interesting history. And the online site also, if you're not a podcast listener, if you're like, I just do not listen to podcasts, every episode has a transcript as well. So if you just want to read it, you can do that. And yes, I have a newsletter where I've been covering sort of things that have been going on. Christine is actually competing this weekend in Botswana. And so I will be sort of watching that. And so as things happen, I'll be covering that. I have a newsletter coming up that's about these various lists that you can find online that allege to be women who have like lost out on medals to quote unquote men, or men who have stolen medals from women by competing in the women's category. And by men, they mean trans women and or women with these sex variations. And I interviewed a woman who is a cis woman who wound up on one of those lists because it's just people like deciding that they think certain people look trans. That's been a sort of interesting side effect of having Tested come out, is I sometimes get to read long comment threads about me and my body and my gender and what they think I am. And as a non-binary person, it's actually really affirming because they cannot decide if I am male to female or female to male. And I'm like, yes, I'm doing it right. Like, I feel like I got it. And you just have to laugh so you don't cry, about these kinds of things. It just feels like such a bizarre way to spend one's time, in my opinion. So yeah, so you can, the newsletter comes out like once a month-ish, so it's not like you're signing up for a ton of emails.
Mm.
And that's sort of where that lives. I will be sort of continuing to look at this. Obviously, World Athletics announcing these new regulations. They haven't come out yet with the full regulations. They've come out with suggested regulations, and so it will be interesting to see if they go through with the sort of full, all females have to go through this, all women who want to compete have to go through this gender verification test, or not. I will be very interested to see how that works out and what they decide to do. So yes, the newsletter is probably the best way to sort of keep up with what's happening on this particular topic. And then what I'm doing next is I learned how to weld. I'm into welding now. So I'm just like, I don't know, I needed to take a break. As you say, I was obsessed with Tested and I researched it for over 10 years. I pitched it for 8 years. I pitched 26 different outlets before I got the yes from the 27th. And then was just so, blinders on, totally focused
Mm.
for that stretch that I just needed some time to not be making podcasts for a while. And so yeah, so I've been doing art, I've been, working on some other stuff. So I'm sure I will reemerge back into the sort of documentary space, but for now I'm welding and I'm blowing glass and doing ceramics and sort of like, the physical world, and making things in the physical world is very satisfying
Mm.
after so much computer time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for this.